Today we're going to be in conversation with a good friend of this radio program, Vijay Prashad. Vijay Prashad is the director of the Tricontinental Institute for Social Research. You could read the Institute's writings online at thetricontinental.org. He's the author of several new books. In fact, we talked to Noam Chomsky just a few days ago, which was a chat book between Professor Chomsky and Vijay Prashad. He has another book out. It's also a chat book. It's called The Struggle Makes Us Human, Learning from Movements for Socialism. It is a chat book along with French activist Frank Bardat. Vijay Prashad is also the editor of another book called Selected Ho Chi Minh, which is a collection of essays from the former Vietnamese leader. And of course, he is the author of the renowned book, The Darker Nations, A People's History of the Third World. Vijay Prashad, great to see you, sir. Thank you for taking time once again to chat with me.
I will never not want to come on your show, Mitch. I enjoy talking to you a lot. Yeah.
Let me begin by showing a bit of respect for Frank Bardat. And I should have asked if I'm pronouncing his name correct. I'm just thinking French, Bardat. Let me give him a level of respect here by stealing one of his questions to you in the book because it interested me. And that was, you state that history is a series of experiments. What is meant by that? Right.
There was a great fascination particularly in Europe, but not only in Europe. There's a great fascination humans have for producing meaning after the fact to historical events. It helps us understand our purpose in the world, what we're doing, and so on. Hegel, the reason I said Europe is Hegel, the great GWF Hegel, as the forces of Napoleon were tearing towards Hegel's city of Jena. He gave a series of celebrated lectures on the philosophy of history. And Hegel wanted to understand history as having a real purpose. There was this Geist, this spirit, world historical spirit, which was perhaps freedom or liberty, which was going to necessarily, wash over the world. And then he was interested in, would this have an impact in China? Would it have an impact in India? We must seek purpose in history. Well, even the older peoples of the Mesoamerica, before the conquistadors arrived, sought purpose in time. They felt that, the universe was held together in a very fragile way. And therefore, humans had to do things in order to keep the universe intact. That included sacrifices to the gods and things like that. We all seek meaning in time. Time cannot be empty. We must fill it with something, some meaning. When people are coming up in the world, they think, what impact can I make on the world, and so on. This idea that you have to imprint a certain kind of morality or a certain kind of judgment on time. Time cannot be allowed to be empty. Well, that's all true. I actually sympathize with that. I also feel like I don't want to live in a kind of meaningless existential, world where we sort of drift through time. You'll recall reading the existentialists, where there was this sense of great drift. Time is carrying us. Time is a river, and we just sort of lie on a lilo and allow the river to take us. No, that's not something that humans are comfortable with. We seek meaning. We want a purpose. We want to swim either upstream or downstream or whatever across the river. And in that sense, by wanting to imprint our meaning on the world, on time, we experiment. We try to make things happen. We keep doing things. And one of the lessons I learned quite early is, if you're not willing to fail, you'll do nothing. If you only want to win, you'll do nothing. Because part of attempting to do things in the world is to understand that you must have the capacity to fail. There's nothing wrong with failure. I learned that as a little kid, that you go out there and you play a sport, or you try to memorize a poem, or you try to do a mathematics test. It is inevitable that you'll do poorly, and if you don't do poorly, you'll not do anything at all. When we learn through our mistakes, we learn to try and be better the next time. In that sense, history is perhaps not so much cyclical. We keep repeating the same. I don't think we always repeat the same mistakes. We repeat them differently. We understand history and we try to not do it, we repeat it. So I'm very keen on having us have conversations about history as a series of experiments in order for us to understand that you don't judge things negatively. Like, okay, you attempted to build socialism, let's say in Vietnam, after the unification of the country in 1975. Well, there were a lot of failures, and there's a reason why there were some failures. They had to do with the context of great poverty and, Agent Orange in every leaf, basically in the center of Vietnam and so on. Also, there were human failures. People who were in charge made a lot of mistakes. They did the land reform in a way that didn't work. That may not be because they could anticipate the mistake. In the doing, a mistake took place. They learned from it. So in that sense, one should not be afraid to try to change things in the world. Don't accept it for what it is. If things are not good right now, we have to be courageous enough to experiment with better things, not in order to always succeed, but sometimes just in order to learn.
Failure oftentimes is a way of sort of ending, I guess, a project or an experiment immediately, stop it in its tracks.
I think that's an attitude we need to really get out of. Imagine, and let's go back to the issue of a child or a young person coming to terms with the world. If a child fails, does it end their attempt to become a better person? I hope not. One of the sad things, in a way, with an overly moral political system that is rooted in, this idea of imprisoning people and so on. Let's take most of our world today. Let's be frank about it. People make mistakes all the time. There are mistakes of poverty, for instance. I am hungry. I need something. I go and I instead of trying to change the world, I rob from somebody. I get arrested. And then I get sent to prison in a kind of moralistic condemnation of the person. There is no room really. There's very little space to understand even that level of error made by a person, individual person who robs, to get out of a difficult situation. Well, we don't have any latitude for that person. Forget when a political movement attempts to change something. What is politics but the frailty of individuals combined, because it's really difficult to change things. And I want to say this pretty straightforwardly, like particularly in the world of socialism. Socialism makes an enormous demand on history, because we are asking ourselves, with all our frailties, with our problems, including problems of we love our family more than we love people we don't know, right? These are all frailties. Now, by family, I don't necessarily mean the people you were born with, might have problems with them, but friends, you love them more than people outside. We give names for this like nepotism. You are nepotistic towards your family and so on. This is part of the equation of human frailty. We are frail. So we are trying to build something where we take care of everybody through frailty, through enormous social hierarchies. We want to go beyond them. I had once read an American poet, Muriel Rukeyser, who had a beautiful line saying that communists are exiles from the future. I sit with that line a lot, because it's true. If you are a person who believes in equality fundamentally and so on, and you live with those values in the world today, where all around you those values don't exist as such, they are not established. You want to create a relationship that's loving and on an equitable footing, but the social structure doesn't permit you to actually do that. Gender relations reinsert themselves, even though you are trying your best not to establish your own relationship based on conventional gender understandings and so on. So in that sense, a socialist project is a project against history and against human frailty. One has to have a little bit of compassion for these projects, and not be so dismissive and say, well, it failed, so that's the end. In my understanding, failures on this path are not the end. Failures on this path are merely milestones where we can enshrine lessons as we continue to return to some of those failures. Because, whether it's in a spiral, downward or upward spiral, you will repeat the same kind of mistake differently over and over again. Like how do we as humans get nepotism out of our social structure? It's really difficult. End of the day, you want to help your people, and even though they may not be the most qualified person, there is a tendency to want to assist them. And all of that is a mess. And we have to work through that. But we first need to acknowledge that a failure is not the end of the book. It's merely the end of a chapter.
Socialism is a struggle, I forget exactly what you said, against history, because the norm in history is nepotism and hierarchy and inequality, where finding equal societies, not to say that they have never existed, usually smaller societies, perhaps, or much more far and few between.
When I was a kid, I read a comic book about the life of Gautam Buddha. And I don't know if you know much about his life. He was a prince, and he was a prince in an area which is now between northeastern India and Nepal. In his travels in his kingdom, he was heartsick by seeing hunger, by seeing, basically illiteracy and so on. He saw all these things and he returned to the palace and said, I can't deal with it. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the forest and I'm going to enshrine a sangha. We're going to be a group of people, a society of people, monks, mendicants. We are not going to take our money with us, but we're going to go every day with a bowl. They were known as bhikkhus. They would beg. So we'll beg for our food. And in this place, we will meditate on how to make the world better and so on. Buddhism is a very radical philosophy.
Especially against the ruling philosophy, and still the ruling philosophy, I guess, today, or at least religious philosophy of India.
Yes, I mean, it was against the caste system, against the degradation of people being outcasts and so on. True. But, Buddhists then struggled over the course of the next 1,000 years and began to absorb these corruptions of caste and distinction. And you even got to the point where the Buddhist monk was treated like a king, like in Tibet, for instance. The Dalai Lama is virtually a monarchical figure. That's because all our traditions struggle with history, with the frailties of history. And to make a decisive break with the past is really difficult. I'm not giving the Buddhism example to denigrate Buddhism. Quite the contrary. I have the highest respect for the Buddha and what was attempted. But I use that as an example merely to say, to make ourselves better, we have to deal with the fact that our histories are pretty wretched. And you can't make a decisive break with yourself. I mean, look at you and I as two individuals. There's a lot inside us that we struggle with, our feelings, our emotions, our behavior. There is no way, no human can claim to be perfect. They are full of frailties and problems, and they make lots of mistakes, and they treat people badly because we inherit a lot from our past. And even though theoretically I want to be kind to everybody, of course I'm not kind to everybody. I can be pretty sharp with people and so on, and then I regret it. Well, if that is the case with individuals, Mitch, and if we can acknowledge that as individuals, imagine when you're trying to build major experiments of social transformation. It's not easy, which is why sections of the right, people like Friedrich Hayek, for instance, who wrote the celebrated book, The Road to Serfdom in 1944, and is the founder of, neoliberalism, what's called neoliberalism. That's why people like Friedrich Hayek and others condemned the attempt to change the world, saying you'll just end up in tyranny. And I think that level of cynicism depresses me. Because something is difficult doesn't mean you don't try it. I mean, look at humans. We wanted to go out into space. It was not easy. People died trying to do that. You want to cross an ocean. It's not easy. People died doing it, but we persisted because the human spirit. And here I'm going to say something perhaps that somebody of my kind of politics shouldn't say, but I think the human spirit is extremely powerful and is unwilling to surrender to pettiness. I think hierarchies and wretchedness and poverty and all that are wretched, petty parts of human history. Look, the dinosaurs were around for millions of years. There was a debate recently, somebody said about, dinosaurs went extinct. They've been around for millions of years. This is actually the rail strike in the UK. Somebody went on a show and said that unions are dinosaurs. And the union leader, Mick Lynch, said dinosaurs lasted millions of years before they went extinct. Humans have only been around for, 700,000. And we're already at the verge of extinction. So I'd prefer to be a dinosaur than to be a human. I thought that was a really good answer and accurate as well. But, we are not saying we're going to, let's just surrender to reality. This reality is not worth surrendering to. And that's why, regardless of, calls saying there's no hope of changing things, history has ended, every generation produces its cohorts of sensitive people who want to change things. Black Lives Matter, not surprising. Protests against the Supreme Court decision on women's right to choose, not surprising. People don't want to live with the pettiness of the past. They want something better, but that's hard. And that's what I want to actually underline.
So this idea of failure, it kind of gets me to my next question, which is also a title of a chapter in your book, again, called The Struggle Makes Us Human. And this chapter is called The Long Effect, The Fall of the Soviet Union. The fall of the Soviet Union has had tremendous impact on socialist movements ever since.
First I should say that I had the great privilege and honor of being alive when the Soviet Union was there. I was born in 1967. In the 1980s, I went to the Soviet Union. I had the opportunity to see a few things. It was in great distress at the time, economic distress more than anything else. The Soviet Union had an enormous impact on the world because it was an extremely poor country in 1917. It had been devastated by war. It had been devastated by the form of agricultural life imposed on the countryside by the Tsar and the nobility. It was a very poor country. In my youth, I read the novels of Tolstoy and Turgenev, Ivan Turgenev, and I understood how wretched the agricultural life was. It reminded me of contemporary India. Reading 19th century Russian novels reminded me of 1970s and 1980s India. Agricultural life, the hierarchies, the treatment of people like animals, effectively. And what the Soviet Union had been able to do was to break past that, to industrialize the country, to collectivize parts of agriculture. Again, enormous mistakes made, terrible suffering, but the suffering was happening anyway. When people say, there was this terrible thing that happened, the collectivization, as if what was there before was good for the people. It was appalling. They were trying to do something to improve the situation. And perhaps there were lots of errors. And that's the nature of the experimentation and failure and so on. But it was inspirational because when Jawaharlal Nehru, the Prime Minister of India, traveled to Russia in 1927, 10 years after the revolution, he wrote a little book called Soviet Russia, published in India, disseminated widely, in which he said, look, if they can do it, if they can raise literacy rates, 20 years after Nehru published that book, that was in 27, India is independent in 1947, the literacy rate after almost 300 years of colonialism in India was 13%. That means 13 out of 100 people could write their names, Mitch. The standard of literacy tests, I don't know if people know that, is extremely low. You don't have to, literacy doesn't mean you can pick up a book and read it. It merely means you can write your name on a piece of paper. It's a very low test. We need a better test for literacy. But in 1947, or actually in the first census, it was 13%. Now, 20 years before that, Nehru was looking and saying, my God, in 10 years, they've doubled the literacy rate. If they can do things like that, we can do things like that. That's the inspiration. You see, there was no point Nehru going to the United Kingdom and saying, look at the UK, India can become like that. There's no point, because after all, the UK became wealthy as a consequence of leeching the wealth from India. The Soviet Union was able to advance from 1917 without colonies. They were able to advance because they used planning. They used their social wealth. They put the money into things like ending hunger, ending literacy, providing housing for people. But they used their own wealth. They didn't go and steal wealth from somewhere else. So for somebody like Nehru, it was no point going to, Manchester and saying, look at the conditions of people better. No, because India couldn't have colonies to enable you to do that. But the Soviet Union did it with their own resources. And that's why it was so inspirational to people like Nehru, who was not a socialist. If anything, Jawaharlal Nehru was inspired by the Fabian movement in the UK. These are the people who were the inspiration or the theoreticians of the British Labour Party. People like Beatrice and Sidney Webb. They inspired Nehru, not the socialist tradition. Yet he could see that there was something quite captivating about the Soviet Union. And so when the Soviet Union collapses, it provided two problems for the socialist movement. One is it was a penalty that you'd have to now live with, which is that, look, it was tried and it failed. You're going to be penalized forever, And secondly, the errors within Soviet history, including, the Gulag and all these things, the failures in collectivization here and there. It was not all a failure here and there. The movement of populations and so on. Those will all be used to penalize socialism. There were two penalties, therefore. One, the fact that it collapsed, and secondly, its internal failures, which are obviously going to happen, because again, human beings are making a process and they're going to make mistakes and do things that are wrong.
It's fascinating how much of an effect the Soviet Union has had on the global left, all the way from the beginning. And one thing I want to ask you, something that's always interested me and I've tried to wrap my head around, is they say with the left, we always form our own circular firing squads. And I think you could go back to the French Revolution, the Russian Revolution, the Spanish Civil War. We see it many, many times over. And you could look at the Occupy movement and, or Black Lives Matter even. You can find it almost, you can find it in my home, my radio network. You find it everywhere. It seems ubiquitous. And thinking of the Soviet Union, I've always been pretty fascinated by the split that happened between Stalin and Trotsky, and seemingly how that split the left all the way up to now, to even how people view the war in Ukraine. How do you see that split within the left?
Well, first, let's take the temperament question. See, if you're a person of the right, you want to maintain the status quo as much as possible, perhaps even to revive things from the past. In that sense, your historical task is much easier, because your historical task is preservation of the status quo. You can just ride the wave, you don't have to go against the stream. So you don't really need a theory of society, Mitch. You come in, you're there, you're in power, and you just make sure that everything is in its place. And the theory of society you require is essentially a roadmap of the present. It's a static map. You don't need a dynamic map. The moment you enter into a project of transformation, you're going to have really, really different theories operating. Some people are going to talk about we need to consolidate the gains now. Others are going to say, no, if we don't accelerate here, the gains will be vanquished. And the debates are intense because you're trying to do something much more different than just maintaining the status quo. And so the left, partly for that reason, produces a series of arguments about what is the strategy for the way forward. That's one. Secondly, it is also true that in the left, there is a tendency for people who are quote unquote intellectuals to enter this tendency. Quote unquote intellectuals. I don't just mean university professors. I mean, because there's a great demand on thinking about strategy and so on, the movement produces people for whom this kind of thought process is normal, natural, and necessary. You have to think about what you're doing. Like, how do we marshal our resources? It's a much more intellectual tendency than the right. Again, because the right is maintaining the status quo. I don't mean they're not thinking about what they're doing, but the tendency for thought is not necessary. They can unite around a common defense of the present much quicker than the left can unite around a strategy for transformation. So the fractiousness in the left is actually a normal tendency of movements that want to transcend the present. I would say that's a normal tendency. It's not something that you can, get out of. Like, say, why is it this? Why is it that? Then as well, you got to face another, which is that because the left is not a trajectory to maintain the hierarchies, all kinds of backgrounds enter.